Real quick with the announcements, not a whole lot at this point in time, just because it's the middle of winter and we're all still getting through it. Well, today feels like spring, right? It's a heat wave. So 10 degrees feels really warm to me. I know that's probably odd to people that aren't used to it. It feels pretty good to walk outside and not have the cold take away your breath. Oh, yeah, we really do. I do need to tell that story. Hopefully I won't over-embellish it, and I don't want to go too long. On Friday, I walked over here. We had our boilers inspected. And fortunately, the boiler man showed up about 4 hours early before he said he was going to. Sarah texted me and said he's on his way. I'm like, that's fine. I'll just walk over and I'll meet him. So I took him downstairs. There's 2 boilers downstairs here, and there's a boiler that's over in the old part of the church. I took him over to the old part of the church, showed him the boiler, and as I was walking back over here, I'm like, something sounds like it's water running. There's a trickling of some kind. So I walked to the front of the church, and it was not a trickling. It was a gushing coming from the ceiling and down the walls, and we had popped a pipe that was just literally spewing water everywhere. And I believe that I caught it within a few minutes because I put a bucket underneath of it, and it filled pretty fast. And by the time I called Chris in something of a panic, I don't know where to shut everything off. What are we supposed to do? And we got it all shut off, and within a little bit, the water stopped coming from the ceiling, which was really a great thing because it was coming out of a light fixture. That was kind of scary too, all at once. So, and I started making desperate calls to people, and I said, can you please come help us? We don't know what's going on, and we've tried to fix this pipe. And Grand Lake Plumbing, I got a hold of them. They're like, we are 6 plumbers down there. We won't even be able to think about getting out there until next week. I'm like, okay, and can you please send me a list? And they sent me a list, and I was trying to figure out what we were going to do, and out of nowhere, they called me from Grand Lake, and they said, we've got a guy that's got some time, space, and we'll come by and see you. And he came that morning, and he fixed the pipe and was able to find the spot, because we've got this spot that keeps catastrophically breaking down. This is the 3rd time we've had the pipe bust, right? And so there's obviously something wrong with the system, and he was able to identify what was wrong with the system. So we caught it early enough that it isn't major damage. It's not going to be fun to clean it all up. It's not major damage, and he figured out what's going on. And I really saw everything as providence of God. If it had been 4 hours before I came over here, we would really be in a world of trouble over on that side. So I was very grateful. I'm grateful to the Lord for providing all that. I was grateful for Grand Lake and them giving us favor and showing up. So it really was kind of a cool God story when you look at it that way. So thanks for reminding me, Chris. I might have skipped that. Announcement-wise, again, not a whole lot. Awana this coming week is going to be mismatch night, so wear whatever you want to. It won't make any difference whatsoever. What's that? Yeah, as long as it doesn't match. Real quick note, Johanna and Steve, you've probably noticed they haven't been here for a couple of weeks. Johanna's mom has been struggling with some health issues, and they're out in Grand Junction kind of helping her. So her mom's name is Betsy. If you could pray for her just as things, if they come to mind you, and for Johanna and Steve as they're trying to help her and figure out how to balance all those things. We all know when we're taking care of people that we love, that's a hard thing just to go through to begin with. So I would just ask that we would pray for them. And then as always, we don't take a collection. There's a plate in the back that we encourage you, welcome you to give. And there's also plenty of places online to give. And if you're watching this on YouTube, and you're watching through the website, there's a little button right up off the top of there, so it really is pretty easy to do. And I think that's it. Anybody have anything else I missed? Okay. So this week, what we've been going through, for most of us that have been, if you've been here and you've been able to explore with us, we've been going through Mark. And when we started the first part of the year, it was really important to me. I wanted us to spend some time in Mark because I really wanted us to get back to the roots of what our identity is in Jesus, and who Jesus is and how that impacts us. And Mark is just a great place to start with that because it's this action-packed gospel that gives you story after story after story of who Jesus is and just his character and his compassion and his kindness and his power and all these things that we begin to get an idea of who he is. And I really didn't want to do, I said last week, an exhaustive study of Mark. It's just every time I found something like, well, we can't skip that. And part of me has wanted to go back to, because we're in a season of Lent, and it's a church season, and I like the idea that as a church, we can join with other churches in similar ways that they worship through church seasons. And since we're in the season of Lent, which is really kind of a season about identifying with Jesus in the wilderness as he was going through his time of testing and temptation. And it simultaneously goes into this idea of we're moving towards the week of passion, towards the week of his suffering and his crucifixion and his rising, right? Which is what all of this is all about, right? So I wanted us to get back to following along with what's called the Revised Common Lectionary, which is just a series of scripture readings and writings that we can track together with other churches. Psalm 27 that Laurie read this morning comes from some of that, and probably for at least this season, during worship, we'll have a reading from the Psalms or from one of the prophets, because the prophets are very poetic when you start some of the readings that are there. And I like the idea that we're connecting, not necessarily liturgically, just that we're connecting with other churches that are doing similar things all over the world, right? And that, to me, that's kind of a special time. So this week offered an opportunity to transition from Mark into the Revised Common Lectionary, because we're going to talk about the Transfiguration on the mountain. And every single gospel covers this, right? So we get it in Mark, we get it in Matthew, we get it in Luke. So it's an easy way for us to look at something and make the transition into this common lectionary. And the cool thing about Luke, or one of the things about Luke that I like, is he's much kinder to the disciples than Matthew and Mark are. They're pretty brutal on the disciples in the way that they present that. So we explored last week the idea that it's the confession of Peter that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Messiah. And we'll get into a little bit more of that, of how that falls out. One of the things about Luke is he doesn't have Peter confessing that, or he doesn't have him contesting that the Messiah is going to suffer. And what I wonder about that is Luke has a lot of objectives in what he's writing. One is to give us an orderly account. He tells us that. We want to give you an orderly account of the things you've heard so that you can know and understand these things. The other thing that he does is he's prepping us for what the church is going to look like in the early times. And Peter is a central figure to the early church. And so I think Luke kind of gives Peter quite a bit of slack in anticipation of the idea that Peter is going to be the rock that the church gets built upon. And what we're really looking at this morning is all three Gospels, as we get to this place, are pointing to an increased understanding of the divine nature of who Jesus is and how this has been foretold and foreshadowed throughout the Old Testament. And this morning, as we step into the Transfiguration, we're going to step into, and I like this word, it's into a liminal space. Right? So a liminal space is the idea that you occupy a space on two sides of a boundary or a threshold simultaneously. It's not like you're sitting on the fence looking at one or the other. You're sitting in both spaces at the same time when you're in a liminal space. And so this morning, we're going to sit in the Old Testament and the New Testament simultaneously. We're going to sit in heaven and earth simultaneously. And we're going to have this idea of the law and the covenant and the prophets and Jesus coming together all at once with this amazing picture of the divine nature of Jesus and his heavenly glory. And there's probably two major emphases here that we're going to take a look at. Obviously, Jesus as the supreme Messiah, the glorious one, right? And the whole purpose of the Transfiguration, this particular scene, is really to bring Peter and John and James. However, after the initial introduction, we only get that it's Peter's companion. So the focus is on Peter in this particular passage. And it's to bring them into a deeper knowledge and a deeper awareness, an awakening of who Jesus is. And once again, we got to put the emphasis on Peter gets put in a position one more time to learn more about Jesus. And I do believe that it is always in preparation. There is this kind, passionate, patient Jesus that is pulling Peter along because he knows of the role that Peter's going to have in the church. And the cool thing about Peter, in spite of failing multiple times, we see that over and over in the gospel, he never gives up. He keeps hanging in there, right? And he continues to get this increasing knowledge, this increasing awareness of who Jesus is, right? And also, the passage gives us insight into the kindness and the compassion of Jesus at the same time. And this patient, long-suffering mentoring of Peter, who's going to become the leader of his church. And all the way, he's teaching Peter right? Because he remains at the center of God's plan, right? And it's going to be who everything rests on after the resurrection and after Jesus ascends into heaven. So let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 34. That didn't help much. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up into the mountain to pray, to a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving, Jesus said to him, "Master." Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen. Would you pray with me? Father, as we step into this amazing scene, this space where we sit in between and at the same time simultaneously in heaven and earth, and we get glimpses of the divine glory of you, Jesus, and the way that you bring us along, the way that you awaken us to who you are. Lord, I ask that your Spirit would come and touch each of our hearts. And Lord, that the words that come from me would just be you speaking through me. And I ask that this morning we would get an understanding of who you are and who we are and how you continue to call us to a deeper knowledge and understanding of you. In Jesus' name, amen. And so we start with verse 28. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Again, the main purpose here, this whole scene, is about bringing Peter and James and John into a greater awareness. And we have this focus that really is more on Peter. It's essentially about a week since Jesus has said, "You are the Christ." And Jesus has said, well, this is what that means for me to be the Christ. I'm going to suffer and I'm going to be crucified and then I'm going to rise again. Right? And Peter, the words last week we talked about, Peter rebukes Jesus, which is just ironic when you think about it, right? And says, no, that can't be. This is not what we signed up for. You're going to be this victorious, powerful king. You're not this suffering servant. And Jesus corrects him and tells him, no, that you don't understand what's going on. And he uses those words that a lot of people are pretty familiar with. Get behind me, Satan. Right? And we talked about that was probably more about understanding where the knowledge was coming from or where those words were coming from rather than calling Peter Satan. Right? What Jesus tells him is, you have the mind of man. You don't have the mind of God. Right? And all along, he keeps including Peter because Peter is still this rock. Right? And Peter keeps plugging away in spite of all these failures and all these humiliations. That's going to be a consistent theme that we'll see throughout the Gospels. Right? And Jesus keeps correcting and restoring, another consistent theme that we're going to see throughout here. And I try and envision this conversation between Jesus and the Father, like, Dad, what are we going to do about Peter? Right? We've said he's going to be the rock that gets built upon, where the church builds upon, and I can't get him to understand this. Right? I keep trying to get him and bring him along, and I think he's there, and then he says this thing that we know he's not there. How are we going to get that straightened out? And in some ways, I think this is part of the plan that he and the Lord and the Father are like, let's see if we can show him who you really are and get him to connect with what that means in the bigger picture, going all the way back to the Old Testament and moving forward, what the future is going to be like. Right? So I think that's part of what's going on. And so he takes him up to the mountain, which will be a motif that we will see a little bit more here, right? He takes them up to the mountain to pray, right? And as they pray, the verse says Jesus is changed, right? The appearance of his face changed. Matthew and Mark, the word is transfigured. And it's a really important word because the Greek is metamorpho, which is where we get the word metamorphosis from, right? Which is the idea of a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. So we're looking at something that is plain and going into beauty, going into splendor. And we know from Isaiah that Jesus was not a handsome guy. He was not the most beautiful guy on the planet, and that was intentional, right? In this particular moment, though, he's transfigured into amazing heavenly beauty. And I think we need to get a glimpse of that because this transfiguration happens from the inside out, right? He literally changes and glows from within. Now, the commentators that I read and researched believe that Luke didn't say the word transfiguration because of his audience, and there would have been a confusion perhaps with pagan or Greek mythology that he didn't want to have metal in the middle of it. So he used the word transformed instead. The other gospel writers say transfigured and metamorphosis. And Jesus' clothes become brilliant, bright white. And when you read Mark's version of this, it says his clothes were whiter than any launderer could bleach them. The Greek in Luke, though, refers to something that gleams or flashes forth like lightning. And it's the only time in the New Testament that this word is used. A similar word, though, is what's used to describe the lightning that happens on Mount Sinai when Moses meets with God. And we'll talk about that in a few verses. For here, though, Jesus is transforming into this beautiful heavenly body right before their eyes. Right? He's gleaming like lightning. And we get this glimpse of what the future glory of Jesus is going to look like following his week of passion. And we come to verse 30. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor. Talking with Jesus, they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Moses and Elijah, they appear glorious splendor. The Greek word for that is doxy, and it means splendor and brightness. And what we're getting is we get a similar resemblance to what Jesus is going through in his own glorified body. I think it's intentional that it's not as brilliant or dazzling white. Jesus is still superior in this moment. However, we're getting this culmination of what is a dazzling group of three people that are standing together. And Moses, in this particular scene, is representing the law, and he's representing the covenant. He's representing the Old Testament. He comes onto the scene as this is what the old looked like. And there's also the idea that Moses is the person who leads the Jewish nation out of bondage into the promised land and into freedom. And then we have Elijah, and Elijah represents the prophets. And probably Elijah's biggest focus as you read through him in the Old Testament is he was going to rescue the Jewish faith from corruption and them chasing foreign gods. And we also have in Malachi where Jesus has to come before the Messiah. And so that's why I think we have Moses and we have Elijah in this particular scene, right? There's this culmination of the law and the prophets as they're being fulfilled in Jesus. And we have three brightly glowing beings in their glorified bodies having this frank discussion in front of the disciples. I would ask you to just try and put yourself in that scene, right? It's an amazing scene when you think about it. And they're talking about his upcoming passion, right? The journey to Jerusalem, right? And the language is really important here. So what we get is they were talking about his departure, right? Is really the word exodus. Again, we get these Old Testament overtones, right? It's this transition to freedom from the new covenant where Jesus is leading an exodus into this new freedom that's the new covenant. And when he says it's the fulfillment in Jerusalem, fulfillment is the word plerou in Greek. And that means to bring to completion, right? Something or bring into completion or to accomplish something is probably a better translation. And it's the idea of completing an action in which someone has been involved in since the very beginning. And I really believe that from the very first words in the Bible, Jesus is present in the creation of earth. Jesus, this is something that's been happening for a while. And we need to understand the cross and a suffering servant is not random or happenstance, right? It's not this remedy that wasn't anticipated from the very beginning of time. Jesus is bringing to fulfillment all these laws and all the prophets. And once again, the scene that we're seeing is for the benefit of the disciples, and especially Peter. And I think the communication here is, regardless of what happens on the cross, the future glory of Jesus and of the disciples will be certain. And in verse 32, we see Peter and his companions were very sleepy. When they became awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. I think the English Standard Version, the ESV, gives us a better literal translation of this, which is, now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. When they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Heavy with sleep is an idiomatic phrase, right? I don't think they were physically asleep, right? Because, number one, they would not have witnessed the transfiguration. We wouldn't have that recorded if they were asleep, if they were physically asleep, right? And we get the details of what they're discussing. They're talking about the Exodus and the fulfillment of time as Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And I also think that this is the main reason why they brought them up there. So if they were starting to drift off to sleep, I'm pretty sure Jesus would have done one of these things, right? Wake up, you're probably going to want to see this. Maybe kick them across the prayer circle, right? Pay attention, this is going to be important. You want to know these things, right? And so this becomes, it's more figurative. So Peter has been asleep, and we see this, and we've seen this over and over again. He doesn't quite get the true identity of Jesus. He knows that he's something special. He knows that he's something important. He doesn't quite get the full identity yet, though, right? And he's asleep to what that means. And what he is, like all of us, a lot of times, he's fixed on what's earthly and present, right? Versus what is heavenly and in the future. And this is an epiphany moment for Peter. I'm convinced of it. Oh, wait, now I get it. I'm starting to wake up to this idea of who you really are. He's understanding the significance of who Moses and Elijah is in this picture, right? And they've never been introduced. He just knows who they are. And he understands the glory that they are all exuding. And this creates the context for the next verse. And I'm going to continue with the English Standard Version because I think they do capture the original language a little bit better. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. I think Peter's in shock, right? All this is, like I asked you to step into that scene, would you have good words in that scene to be able to say anything? I think it would be really hard. He doesn't know what to say. The other gospel accounts, Mark and Matthew, say that he's terrified. Right? What I think is happening here, though, is Peter's waking up. And he is giving an increased understanding of who Jesus is. He's not a buffoon here. He's not just sort of babbling along. Peter's offering to build 3 tabernacles, right, or tents. He wants to create 3 memorials for this event. And from the Old Testament, there was a Feast of Tabernacles. And what that did was it commemorated the Exodus and the temporary dwellings that the forefathers lived in while they were walking through the desert. In the Jewish tradition, it was also a promise of the coming kingdom. Again, we're sitting on the Old Testament and the New Testament all at the same time. So Peter's recognizing in the significance of the light of Moses and Elijah, he's just elevated Jesus to that same status. He's all of a sudden understanding you are as important as the people in the Old Testament who we've been reading about since we were young kids. He's starting to get this picture of who it is, right? And we can see Peter's more awake than he was. He's still not fully awake. Right? So God is going to take his understanding of who this is with Elijah and with Moses. He's going to take it to the next level. As he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." The cloud is clearly the presence of God, and it creates fear. And we're going to step back into the Old Testament for just a second. When you look at the Old Testament and Moses during Exodus, right, in Exodus 19:9, the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. And then in verse 18, when the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. Excuse me. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die. This is the cloud that's overshadowing them right now. This is the cloud that they are engulfed in, right? It envelops them. And there's this fog, this is dense cloud cover. And here in the higher elevations, that's almost easier to see because sometimes we get into places where there are clouds that cover us, right? It's like we are actually in the clouds. It's not fog. We are in the midst of a cloud, and you can feel how that sort of overwhelms you. And in the Old Testament, the cloud was always a sign of the presence of God and his protection. As they walked through the desert, right? By day, it was a shield to keep them from the scorching sun. And at night, it was a fire so that they would be, number one, have light and they would be warm. So the cloud is a clear sign to Peter and his companion that the voice that they are hearing is God's, right? And in the cloud in Exodus, Moses is receiving instruction about what to do going through Exodus. The same thing is happening here because God's instructions to Peter is what? Listen to Jesus. Listen to what he has to say to you. This is my son. For Peter, this is the first time that he's hearing this. He wasn't there at the baptism, right? This is the first time he's hearing, this is my son, my chosen one. And it's probably more appropriate to say, the one who has been chosen. It is a divine title for the Messiah. And my chosen one will reinforce that Jesus is fulfilling Isaiah's suffering servant prophecy. So in Isaiah 42, here's my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teachings, the islands will put their hopes. So Peter's getting another level of awakening. More and more he's starting to see. And the voice of God in this case is actually affirming what Peter said back in chapter 8 in Mark, right? Where he says, you're the Messiah, you're the chosen one, you're the Son of God, right? And this voice tells Peter, you better listen to him. So step by step, we're pulling Peter along into this greater understanding of who he is. And we come to verse 36. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. I envision this profound silence. There's been all this chaos that's kind of going on around them, and all of a sudden it's still. And we've talked about this a few times. I think it's a great calm. Right? It felt like a storm, a tempest, and there's this great calm, and at the center of it, Jesus still remains. And it says that the disciples keep silent. And some of the commentators that I researched, they reference Matthew and Mark and say that this was Jesus' instruction to them, that they should keep quiet. I don't think that follows the theme of what we're getting. It seems to me this is another way that Luke is demonstrating that Peter has gone into a deeper level of understanding. Because every time Jesus has done something profound up until now, right after he gets done, what does he say? Don't tell anybody. Right? In this particular instance, it's almost like the light bulb is going off for Peter as well. I'm not going to say anything about this until later on, until after things have happened. Right? So like Peter and his companions, right? I believe that the Lord continues to lead us to grow in him in the same ways. Sometimes this will happen through mountaintop experiences that are transformative. Sometimes they happen in really deep valley experiences. And with each experience, I think we awake and can start to anticipate greater awakening. Most of us who have walked in the faith for a while, we know and we have a deeper level of what we believe about Jesus than we first started, or at least I hope so. And that begins to, and we can also anticipate that we have not arrived yet because it's an infinite amount of knowledge that we could start to begin to have. And Paul speaks to this in his letter to Corinthians. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12, for now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And the Message version of this, I thought, captured it a little bit better, a little easier to understand, maybe not better. We don't yet see things clearly. We're squinting in a fog, peering through a mist. But it won't be long before the weather clears and the sun shines bright. We'll see it all then. See it all as clearly as God sees us, knowing him directly, just as he knows us. And as I thought about this idea of waking up, I was asking God to give me some pictures of this. And so hopefully I can get through this without crying, because as I thought about it, it really brought these tears of joy for me. One of my sons struggles with he has a very slight cerebral palsy, and he was a little bit later walking than my other two sons were. And I can remember him struggling to walk and kind of noticing, like getting it and not really getting it. He would take a step or two and fumble and fall down. I recall clear as day. See, I can't do it. The day that he stood up and he looked at me and this bright smile came across his face. It was like all of a sudden this light bulb walked up. And he just walked right over to me. That's the kind of awakening that we're talking about. It's this bulb that goes off that goes, wait a minute, now it's all coming together. I get it. And we see this in all kinds of metaphors in life, right? Riding a bike. We start barely being able to ride before we start doing wheelies and taking jumps and doing stupid things that are going to hurt us later on, right? And we see it as a musician, right? We study notes, we study scales, we listen to theory, we start to practice things. And it feels kind of like, I don't really know what I'm doing, and I'm kind of trudging my way through clay or through mud. And then one day, all of a sudden, a light bulb goes on and goes, wait a minute, I'm making music. Right? Same kinds of ideas as what we're talking about here. You know, athletes, careers, each step that we take as we learn something, we become more and more awake to what we're doing. And this happens in our walk with God. I'm convinced of it. When we're intentional and we're attentive, right? When we're spending time with God, we start to get more and more awake moments, right? For some of us, it's prayer. For me, it's always been worship, right? For some people, it's spiritual disciplines like fasting. A lot of times, I gain wisdom, I get insight from reading other people who have walked before me and reading even some of their devotionals or some of the things that they've written. And these are not always, like I described my son walking to me, these are not always joyful moments, right? They're not moments of awakeness, but they're not always joyful. Sometimes they are humbling convictions, right? As we begin to awaken to our own fallen nature, right, we begin to notice there are some sins we're doing we haven't even been paying attention to. And God is gracious to us. He clicks that bulb off and says, what do you want to do about that now? And with every degree of awakening, I believe we step closer and closer to what is our God-given identity, right? We transfigure. We are all like caterpillars transfiguring into the image of God. So again, I'm going to quote Paul in 2 Corinthians this time, in verse 18. And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is Spirit. And the veil refers back to the Old Testament. When Moses would hang out with God, he would have to put a veil over his face to come back and hang out with the Israelites because he was too bright. And then he would take the veil off again to go back into the tent of meeting, right? That's kind of what I believe that image is there. And as we contemplate the Lord's glory, and the Greek reads, as we behold as in a mirror, we reflect as we reflect the Lord and are transformed, right? We lead others into that same kind of space. And this is all as we spend time. We're increasing our understanding and being transfigured into his image. And again, this word transformed in the verse that I just read, we're being transformed into his image. It's the same metamorpho again. It's the same idea of being transfigured from an earthly to a heavenly kind of idea of who we are, with increasing glory. And this is all coming from God, who is Spirit. And I believe that Peter goes through this transformation himself. He goes through this transfiguration, and then God uses it to lead others. And Peter knows this is our identity as well. And he calls us to this same transformation and reflects this idea in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Do y'all hear the parallels in this passage? Right? You're a chosen people. You're a chosen one. You are God's special possession, each one of us, right? And he's brought us out of darkness. He's bringing us out of being heavy with sleep into this wonderful, dazzling, brilliant light where we have awareness, a deeper understanding, and our faith begins to deepen with every step that we take. And I really believe that Jesus still calls each one of us to come away with him to pray, to be with him, to experience something that deepens waking up, right? It deepens our faith and it deepens our love for him because we begin to recognize something that we haven't grasped before. These light bulbs just start going up. And sometimes it's on a mountain, sometimes it's in a deep valley. And we keep getting called to deeper and deeper levels. And so I'm going to encourage you this morning, start looking for those times. Start looking for the times that you connect the dots, that all of a sudden something comes to you and you go, wait a minute, that's deeper than what I thought it was. Now I understand another aspect of who Jesus is and what that means to me and for me. Right? Sometimes it'll be reading the Bible. I know it does for me. Sometimes I'll read the Bible and go, I'm not sure I've ever noticed that before. Has anybody ever had that experience? Is that really in there? I don't think I ever noticed that. And sometimes it's a phrase sung in worship for me. Right? This thing will connect, and I don't know, maybe it's where I am circumstantially, where I am in my life. Something just goes off. And something inside transforms in that moment. And we need to remember, Jesus keeps patiently drawing us in and calling us and encouraging us. And he will provide unsuspecting opportunities for us to learn more of who he is. So the more we pay attention, the more often we notice, the more we become like him. And the more we reflect his presence and his glory to everybody around us.